Okay, morning. I'm going to make a start now, as we've got a prompt finish for your next session following this. And I will cut and paste the link actually once we've completed this session for that. But I will now get started on this session. Can you talk the talk? My name's Raj Patel. I look after the area called Student Voice and Partnerships at the university, and that means I look after a couple of surveys that we do at the institution, and more specifically, work we do around them. So the National Student Survey and our Graduate Outcomes Survey, and I work with our schools and departments around some of the improvement work as well. My other role here is I work with the Careers Service, and so some of you might come across me there. My previous role there was the Deputy Head of Service, and so I still do work on appointments and around guidance as well. So if you have any questions around these things, or in fact careers, you're more than welcome to pick them up with me. Now, in terms of this session today, the objectives for it are to identify the skills that you will need in this role, to understand the role and the impact of evidence. So I'm sure you've got a good grasp of some of the things you'll be doing, or a grasp, and we can talk about some of the things to consider within that, and to think about how you ask the right questions within this role. And then we'll be closing by just some of the thinking around the next steps you might want to apply as a course rep. In summary, this session is about understanding how you can not just gather evidence, but how you can gather good evidence. And by good evidence, what I mean is stuff that is robust, something that you can confidently rely on if you are, being challenged, for example, by a department. But crucially, evidence that is representative. That's what I mean by good. Something that represents the views of the students that you represent and are working with. So we're going to cover, several things during this session. We're going to talk about key skills. We're going to talk about something called the feedback loop, some of the approaches you can take when gathering evidence, something you need to consider called confirmation bias, and the importance of closing the loop. So they're all things that we'll cover as part of this session. And what I'd like to do before I go on to the next slide that I just flicked onto is we're going to talk about key skills, but just for the next minute or so, what I'd like you to do is list in the chat what you believe are some of the key skills you need in your role as a course rep. So just a minute listing those skills you think are important. Okay, got some really good suggestions here. I think a very comprehensive one there from Kate. So I think some of the key skills as a rep involve being approachable and being aware of the multiple voices and backgrounds you may be representing, not just your own. I think it's a really good actually summary of the role there. So thanks for that, Kate. So you've listed some skills there. On this next slide, they are by no means an exhaustive list of skills because there are lots. And I'm talking about these skills within the context of this role around how you're gathering feedback. But these are some of the skills that I think any individual in this role needs to bear in mind. And the first one links that point Kate made about being representative. You've got another point there about the ability to analyse and report on information gathered. It's not the first thing that springs to mind, as you're gathering feedback, synthesizing that and reporting back to whoever, whether it be within a strategy committee or to your peers, is something to bear in mind. Within the context of this conversation, research skills is something that we're going to touch on. But I noticed that someone talked about being approachable. Ability to negotiate something, which is important in this role. Being diplomatic. So you've got a list of things there that you need to consider, within this role. And communication, organisation are some of the things that many of you have listed and shouldn't be overlooked. Within the context now of what we're going to talk about, I've highlighted these things. So representative, research skills, critical and questioning, and the ability to reflect and identify areas for improvement in own performance. So the first three, I think, will be fairly intuitive for some of you thinking about this role. That final one, thinking about your role, your impact, is really important, I think, as you go throughout the year, because you've been, elected by your peers for a number of reasons. And so it's important to think about, what impact you're having, but also from, a selfish point of view, from a developmental point of view, you want to think about, well, okay, how am I going to build on, how am I going to build on the things that I've been tasked with? How am I going to maybe talk about this in a future application? And so there is this aspect of how you work to support and, in a sense, serve your peers. There's another aspect in terms of how you are delivering things you can talk about in future, because that's where there is another value in this role. It gives you some really tangible things you can talk about in applications and when you are in an interview situation. So I mentioned my other roles in careers, and I've certainly dealt with many reps who can talk in their applications and give very good examples when they're being asked this in applications. So all these skills are important. There are a few things there for you to think about, and I'll touch on actually probably quite a bit over the next half an hour or so. So the first thing I'll talk about is the feedback loop. Now, some of you may come across this. It's a very common model that's used. Very common when talking about evaluations, and particularly in things like the workplace. So in terms of that feedback loop, it's important to gather evidence. And within the context of this role, it would be things like key comments, feedback, and to build on that evidence. So the key point here is, whilst gathering evidence is important, you need to build it because, to be blunt, one or two instances won't necessarily drive a change. Those one or two things that get raised may be anomalies as well. But building evidence creates a stronger case for driving the change or addressing the point that has been made. Third point is around trying to, stay solution focused. Now, there are some challenges around that, and we don't want to do that at the expense of gathering feedback, because sometimes the feedback doesn't have a simple solution. But thinking about the solution does help prioritize and focus the mind a bit. And within this context, if there's one thing I'd encourage anyone to do, it's when gathering feedback, can you also understand from them what it is they're looking to change? What does good look like? If that thing they're talking about is addressed, how will their experience be made better? So what it does do is it gives you a stronger basis for a conversation. It's a lot easier to talk about change when you have some ideas about what that change might look like. If it's abstract and you're forcing someone, in this case maybe a department, to try and come up with the issue, they may not be able to, for very good reasons: time, resource, maybe not quite understanding what the impact of that change might be. These are all things that will slow down, the delivery of any change. But where you can, working with your peers to identify what good looks like, as I call it, is really important. And the next stage of this feedback loop is how you then feed back to your peers. Whether you address the issue and there's a solution in place, or whether you can't, it's still important to feed back to your peers so they understand where their feedback has gone. And this is actually a general rule in the working world, generally. So if you whether it's customer service, whether it's staff management, things being escalated, feeding back is really, really important, because where things maybe haven't been addressed, you can then have a conversation and help someone either understand why those things haven't been addressed, or maybe it will identify further points to then revisit that particular point. So it's this model, if you like, that has structured the session I'm going to deliver now. And this feedback loop just helps you think about the stages you'll go through when you are working with your peers and delivering this role. Now, in terms of that first one, gathering evidence, there are lots of different ways, more than ever, to get evidence from your peers. Long gone are the days, I guess, of paper surveys or lots of paper surveys, although they're still just as effective. You've got the options now to do lots of different things. I think the key thing here is there isn't a perfect option, but there are options which are better depending on the sort of question that you're asking, or indeed you intend to do with the data. Polls are great for just some snap opinions to get maybe a rough idea, to get an indication. But for more substantive pieces of work that you might be doing, they may not be as robust, and there might be questions around the data that comes from them. For example, polls don't normally give you the ability to, I guess, understand the demographics that sit behind it. So in other words, the characteristics, whether people are male, female, their gender, etc. And so that might limit what you can do with that data. Polls are great for just an indication, maybe a snapshot of how things are going. And it can often be good at maybe narrowing down things you are focusing on or that you need to look at. But as I said, the key thing is trying to understand and use the method according to what it is you want to do. And as a general rule, if you're planning on a more substantive survey, questions, then the social media platforms don't tend to be very good. That's where you're looking at some of the survey platforms that we use. You've got a number of things there, and in previous years, course reps have used all of these. One which is clearly more challenging in the current circumstances, is valuable if you can do it, is anything in terms of focus groups and face-to-face, because you can get a lot more information. But I do recognise in the current circumstances that is more challenging. Facebook polls have also been used quite a bit in the past, as has things on Instagram as well. And again, they're good at getting indications. So these are all ways of gathering evidence and things for you to think of in your role. And next, I'm going to talk about survey questions. Now, there are lots and lots of, there's lots of guidance around this. Any of you working in a social science or indeed psychology, if there are any psychology students among us, will do work around, survey questions. It's a lot of effort goes into this. But I'm going to give you a few pointers to bear in mind when you are writing survey questions. So the first is to limit the use of open-ended questions. Now, there are open-ended questions and closed questions. Does anybody want to just write in the chat what they think a closed question is? Literally 30 seconds. Anyone have a stab? Okay, quality and quantitative are types of data. Okay, you got a prize there for ASA. So a closed question, yes, is one that can be answered by a yes or a no. Does anybody want to have a stab at the open-ended question then? What's that? Yeah, so some good suggestions there. So probably a combination between Simi and I think it's Mariah. You can give any answer, and it's often longer and requires more detail. And there's some really important points there. So thanks, Mariah. There's some good suggestions there. So limiting the use of open-ended question is particularly relevant. What was said there is important because they do require more time and effort and more time to analyze. That's the other key thing. When you're using open-ended questions, there are in fact software packages you can get that help you do what's called qualitative analysis, if you've not come across that term. So you have to think carefully about using that. Second challenge with an open-ended question is that they can put people off because they just perceive it as more work. Many of you will have done surveys in the past, and I'm sure that as you've gone through, you may have got to the open-ended and thought, oh, do you know what? Oh, I'm not sure about this, and you might skip past it. So I would recommend limiting them, and if you are going to use them, to use them towards the end of a survey. It's quite interesting in terms of noticing behaviour. Doing that means they are a little more likely to get completed. I guess when people get through a survey, they feel a bit more committed and they're more inclined to complete it. But an opening a survey with a open question is probably a quick way of not getting any responses, or at least challenges around the response rate. You have to kind of keep your survey questions neutral. So you have to avoid putting your opinion in the question or leading individuals, because in short, it's just going to compromise the data you collect. So we've got an example there where I jokingly say, "Patrol reps are awesome. How awesome do you think we are?" Obviously, you're leading someone down a very clear path there, but you can reframe that quite easily by asking, how helpful or unhelpful do you find student reps? The key thing here, and the key thing to bear in mind when doing any survey, is you want that data to be as transparent as it possibly can. And if somebody challenges you, you want to be able to stand behind it. So try and keep your questions as neutral as you can. You need a balanced set of choices in your survey. So this is what I mean. When you're giving people options, that doesn't really give people much of an option, does it? You're just establishing quite clearly that you're helpful. This is a more balanced set of choices. And these are also referred to as Likert scales. Again, lots of different schools of thought around this. 5 is quite a popular choice in terms of the number of options, but sometimes 4 is opted for, or an even number is opted for, because then you force people down a particular route. You stop them sitting on the fence. I think from my own personal experience, having the 5 does tend to work well, because there are people who do just sit in the middle, but you have to make that judgment when you're putting a survey together. The key point here is to make sure that whatever options you're offering individuals, those options are balanced. Another point when you're putting survey questions together is not to put several things together in the same question. So, for example, you wouldn't ask somebody, how good was the customer service and welcome when you entered the restaurant? Because you're asking two things there. You're asking about the customer service and the welcome. And if people are really positive, you don't know which one exactly they're positive about. And this can be quite important when we're then looking at addressing things, or maybe looking at solutions, because we don't know where to focus our time and where to focus our efforts. So things separate. It can be really tempting when there's lots of things you want to ask and you're trying to keep your survey short, to push things together. It's really, really common. However, you just compromise the data that you're collecting a little bit. And when you're trying to analyze it, it makes your job actually a bit harder. So don't ask two things at once. Make as many questions as possible optional. Subjects don't tend to like being forced into a response. So with online surveys, the more mandatory questions you create, less or fewer individuals, like to respond. People drop out basically. They're like, people do like to skip over questions. Again, some of this is a judgment call. If it's a particularly important survey, for example, and that data is being used for something where, let's say, for example, you're making an investment, then you do want to probably to make more mandatory. But within the context of the work you're doing, you probably have a lot more flexibility. So think carefully is my advice if you're making a question mandatory. And whether or not you make a question mandatory just depends a lot on what you intend to use with the data as well. When you're putting your survey together, you should consult with others. So when you're developing questions, it's important to talk to the Students' Union, get guidance from whoever you can, and talk to your department, because you want to obviously do your role, but sometimes issues need to be handled sensitively. It's a very obvious thing to say, but you wouldn't name an individual in a question, for example. How brilliant is X, or how challenging do you find Y? So that's a broader point, but the key thing here is that when you're asking questions, you might want to think about how others might interpret it. Consulting with these different stakeholders is important. Next, when you're putting your survey together, it's important to try and test it. And by testing it, asking it peers, other individuals that are working in the same area, is useful because it helps you understand how different questions get interpreted. And I think it's really interesting when you are putting surveys together how people can walk away with complete different interpretations of the same question. So doing that work will just help you understand whether people are going to interpret your question in the way it's intended, or whether you might have an unintended consequence from the questions that you're asking. And then finally, and arguably this is the most important point when you're doing a survey, actually, it's thinking about what am I going to do with that data once I've got it? Do I really need it, or is it nice to have? And there are two reasons for that. The first is you shouldn't really be gathering more information than you need to. You're just creating more work for the person completing the survey, and it compromises what you collect. The second is that actually there'll be an obligation on you, and there's an obligation anyway, in terms of data protection, and you start to make things more challenging. So when you collect survey, for example, survey data, for example, and we think about what's called GDPR around data protection, the more data you have around individuals' personal characteristics, the more conditions there are for you when you not just hold that data, but also when you are informing individuals before you collect that data. So it doesn't, it starts to make the job, a lot more complicated. So in short, if you're asking questions around personal characteristics, things that are sensitive, firstly, you need to have a good reason, and secondly, you need to make sure that data is stored, securely, and that data is not being used for anything other than the purpose that you told the subject that it was being used for. So me going through that has probably underlined why having a plan for the data is important, and thinking carefully about what you use that data for is important, because it does mean there is a bit more work for you in terms of holding and managing that data. So that was survey questions. What I'm going to cover now is just some points around engagement. Now, this is the real one of the biggest challenges, I think, in your role. How do you get your peers to engage in the role and in some of the work you do to gain feedback from them. And I've seen lots of different things over the past, but here are a couple of simple things that I can, I've picked out. And some of these shorter surveys, and again, context is important here because these approaches always be appropriate. But individuals have added fun questions in. They've sometimes added it to the end of a survey where they've asked maybe several questions about a course, and they've added one of these fun questions in, and they've shared that with the group. But it just engages individual, and it just makes it a bit more fun. It is that simple. And there's some examples there of things I've seen in the past that people have used. Language is also important. The more formal, the more mechanical language, less, I guess, comfortable the survey feels when you're completing it. So you've got two examples there on the slide in front of you. So you've got the first one there. When thinking about the Students' Union, how would you describe your present satisfaction level on a scale of 1 to 10? Sounds like a very formal way of speaking. And there's an alternative below, which is just literally a bit more concise, a little friendlier. Read the questions out loud is my advice to yourself. In fact, when you're writing anything, read it out loud to yourself, because often when you write something and you're reading in your head, it translates or sounds different once you read it out loud. So doing that will help you get a feel, I guess, in the simplest way, for how engaging that question might be. In terms of how the survey looks, and this might sound quite superficial, but it sometimes helps to add images. So a survey that is just a long list of questions doesn't look very appealing. But I've seen, in the past, individuals and organizations use something a bit more colorful, something a bit more engaging. And because a lot more is done online and over email, individuals have used images as well. It can just be something that grabs attention. It can just be something that engages the individual and the opening. And sometimes that's all you need to get someone just to start doing the survey. And that's a key thing. It's how you grab their attention in the first instance. So there are a few things on engaging, and I'm going to talk about confirmation bias now. Before I jump on to the next slide, what I'd like you to do in the chat is just list down what you think confirmation bias is, or how you would define it. So that's just a minute. What's confirmation bias? A quick definition, please. Anyone gonna have a stab? Okay, got some nice suggestions there. And quite like that last one, just trying to find info that already supports your view. So yeah, very simply, that's what confirmation bias can be. And there's a particular challenge, I think, in your role with this, because it's an easy thing for anyone to fall into. I think it's quite natural. So you've got a stock image there, but this is just one definition. So the tendency to seek out, interpret, judge, and remember information that supports one's pre-existing views and ideas. Now, there are two challenges with this. The first is your role is about being representative, and latching on to certain views or the views of a minority means you're not representing the other people in your group, your class, within your course. So you can inadvertently, I might add, you can marginalize people and disengage people. The second is that if you have a particular view in mind, then it does make individuals a bit less likely to engage with you, and it can make you less likely to challenge information if it supporting your views as well. So I guess the key thing is how do you remain impartial in your role, and how do you almost question some of the things that are being raised to you before they immediately get, I guess, raised. It's something I think each year, we talk about, and it does remain a challenge, but it's something which isn't unique. Everyone has their own, if you like, ideas, their own views, their own pet theories. And I guess the key thing is, it's not that they're wrong, but you've got to question whether or not they're the right things, or they are representative of the group that you are representing. So the risk, and I've talked about a couple, is that only a small number of things get identified at the SSC. And it'd be great if those things get addressed, and it doesn't mean those individuals who are affected by those issues won't be supported. But remember that your role is about representing the individuals in your course. That doesn't mean that issues are majority led. That doesn't mean you can't identify something because it only affects a small number of people. That context is important when you're talking about it within staff student committees, because then that helps individuals figure out the actions that they need to take. Sometimes the action can be quite simple if it's a small number of individuals that's affected. However, if it's a large cohort, if we're talking about a significant number of individuals, a lot more thought may be required for the action concerned. So we're going to talk now about how we close the loop. And this was that last bit of that cycle that we talked about. And in terms of closing the loop, there are lots of things that you can employ. But the key here is just really communication of that outcome. Now, there are lots of approaches, I think, reps have taken in the past. But the key thing, I think, is picking a method or picking a route that is appropriate. You wouldn't, for example, stand in front of a lecture talking about how something has been addressed if it is a fairly small issue that only affected a small number of individuals. A more appropriate way might be an email directly to the individuals that have raised it. However, some of the things that have been used in the past include listing things ahead of at the start of a lecture or at the end of a lecture. So within this context, for example, at the start of your Blackboard session or end of the Blackboard session, some time would have been dedicated to listing some of the things that have been addressed by a staff student committee. And I think trying to do that is important, and you can work out how and when to do that within your staff student committee. So your teaching sessions are an option. Newsletters are another way that have been used, and societies are another way that have been used to feedback things that have been addressed. If there is a newsletter within the department that is used, or an email that goes out from the head of the department, that can also be used to communicate what has been done or what's been delivered from the staff student committee. Or you can use things that are more visual. So if you are on campus, you can use things like notice boards, to get information about those things out. The key, I think, is thinking about what methods you have at your disposal and what is appropriate for the outcomes that you are communicating. Does it need en masse communication, or can it be done directly to those individuals concerned? And sometimes the issues or the outcomes that need to be communicated are a bit more sensitive, and that will also influence how you communicate the outcome. But the key here is that you are communicating the outcome of these conversations. Whether they are good or whether they are bad, it's important, because if something can't be delivered or can't be addressed, there may be a good reason for it, and explaining that might go some way to at least helping someone understand why something hasn't worked for them. So these are some examples here of some things the Students' Union has managed to deliver in recent years. Some of you may have seen these things dotted around, the Students' Union. But the other thing Closing the Loop can do is it really builds a community where the institution and the union is trusted, and there's a feeling of transparency. And those last bits are really important. Transparency breeds trust. It really does. So communication, get these things across, really underlines this, and also I think underlines a value that you as individuals are adding to the student experience. So I'm quite conscious of time because you've got your next session to move on to in 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is going to summarize this point. So I've gone through quite a bit. You will get copies of these slides, and this session will be available as well. So it's recorded. The first thing in terms of summary is when getting feedback from your peers, you need to try and be as specific as you can. And what I mean by that is you need to try and understand what the issue is and try and nail it down, for I guess want of a better way of putting it, because sometimes someone can come with a range of different things and it can be hard to actually understand exactly what it is that they're talking about. It's also important to understand whether the issue they're talking about is isolated or whether it's actually symptomatic of something broad, because that will help contextualize the matter for the department. It doesn't mean it won't get addressed, but it does help them figure out the best way of maybe moving forwards. If it's an isolated incident, for example, they may choose to approach the individuals concerned directly. And then finally, it's important to understand what the impact of that particular thing is, because that will again help contextualize things. Again, understanding impact will help a department, and within a staff student committee, it will have determined how quickly or whether something is addressed. If the impact is significant, for example, it is far more likely that thing will get acted on immediately if it hasn't been acted upon already. Before you go into a staff student committee and before you present things back, the next thing you need to think about is whether or not you've got enough information. So what that means is you know enough about the matter that's been presented to you, and that leads back to what I've just spoken about, but also whether you have examples, because examples are great, I think, at contextualizing things. And then the third point there is whether you have a grasp on what it is peers want to see. So if this issue has been addressed, what does good look like? Is it something, it might be fairly intuitive, for example. Equally, it might be something a bit more challenging that requires, some thoughts. So that will happen in the first stage when you're gathering views from your peers. It is important to try and understand, well, okay, if this thing is working well, what would happen? What would your experience be? What ideally would you like to see? These are some of the questions you might want to ask when you're gathering feedback. Then finally, when you're communicating the outcome of your discussion, it's important to, I guess, feedback to peers what staff said, what the feedback was, and what the next steps are and what the timescales are. So what's the outcome of this discussion going to be? And then you need to think about how you communicate the outcome of this discussion. I talked about some of the options you've got, and the simple thing is talk with your staff student committee and to talk with the students union about some of the options that you've got to communicate the outcome of these discussions. As a basic, all the minutes become available from staff student committees, and they are available to view as well. That's a very basic form of communication, not necessarily the most engaging, I might add. But I would stress this point around communicating the outcome. I've highlighted these 3 points because I guess I like to summarise and bring things down to 3 points. I've highlighted them because I think they're probably the ones which traditionally in this role have been sometimes overlooked. So when gathering feedback from peers, whilst we know what the challenge is, we don't always know what the impact is. And the impact is important because it really helps focus the mind of a department, and it helps them prioritize the feedback they're getting and what needs to be addressed. So do you know what the impact of that particular matter or issue is? Do you know what your peers want to see? Again, it's really easy to identify what's wrong. It's not so easy to understand what good looks like, and sometimes it is challenging. Sometimes there isn't necessarily a quick answer. If you don't know or have an idea of what good looks like, then it's really hard then to know whether you fix them. So if you can get any sort of steer on that, it is helpful. And then finally, that point around communicating the outcome. Now we've come to the end of the session, and we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to paste a link for the next Teams meeting into the chat in a moment. But what I'd like to do for the last couple of minutes is just think about what your one takeaway from this session is and pop it into the chat. And then what I'd like to do, and you don't need to pop this in the chat, by the way, what I'd like to do, just as a point for yourself and to think about your personal development, what I'd like to do is think about what's the one thing you want to get from your experience as a rep over the coming year. And I want you to think about that one thing in terms of your personal development. So if there's something you're not comfortable about doing, if there's something that you're a bit, I don't know, worried about, or if there's actually something that you'd like to develop as a skill, what is that thing you'd like to get out of this coming year? Because I think that's often a good way of, I think, understanding or framing what you do over the coming year. It doesn't mean you do it at the expense of other things because you're focusing on your own personal development, but I do think it's important to understand what you're getting out of the role as well as what you're putting in. So just for the next minute or two, whilst I put the link in for the next session, what's the one thing that you're going to take away from this session? Okay, thanks for those points. I'm just conscious of time. We're coming to the end of this session now. So if you have any further question, I'm going to put my email into the chat. If you have more questions, do feel free to get in touch with me. And I'm more than happy to pick these up. Equally, the Students' Union is also on hand to pick up any questions that you've got. And if you want to pick these up, then do feel free. But than that, thanks for your time today. I know it's a Saturday, so I do appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you, actually seeing you, in future. But have a good day, and thanks for attending.